Please hold whilst we connect you. We connect you. We connect you. We connect you. We connect you.
You're listening to a Redacted special episode. As part of Melbourne Design Week in May 2025, in collaboration with RMIT and sponsored by Better Future and X-Frame, we hosted FUTUREPROOF, a 3-day event showcasing amazing local designs and nightly talks from leading industry experts. The talk you're listening to now is by Phil Rose, founder and creative director at Alquemy.
Tonight I'm going to be talking about what we call at our studio Alquemy persona-centered design, which sounds a little bit like user-centered design, and I'm going to explain the difference as I go through. But first, a little bit about myself. My name's Phil Rose, co-founder of an industrial design studio in Sydney called Alquemy. We also have a small satellite office in Cleveland, Ohio. I want to talk a little bit about part of our process that we use, I would say, for probably 70 to 80% of our projects. We call it the persona-centered design process. It's something that we've honed over the years. I'm going to kind of go through the why, try and get through that pretty quickly. Then I've got some what, where I'll look at some actual project examples of where we've used it and how it's helped us navigate clients and how it's helped us knock the dust off how we think about things and try to be a little bit more creative with our approach to design. And then at the very end, I'll give a really brief overview of how we do it and how we get there. And hopefully you guys can take something away from this talk and build it into your process. I was really wrapping my brains to think of something to talk about tonight. And I think about the best talks I've ever been to. I've learned about someone else's process that you can then try and imbue in your own work. So hopefully you guys get something out of this. Persona-centered design shifts the focus from outcome to origin. And what this really looks at is, I think for a really long time, industrial design has been closer to engineering. And as time has moved on and engineers have become more independent, it's starting to get a little bit closer to almost like three-dimensional branding. So that requires you to think a little bit more creatively and less black and white. It's a lot more nuanced. And often when you're trying to navigate a new client or a project, if you're in-house, trying to anchor that product in a method that helps you create concepts that really tell stories and get everyone on board is a really important skill to learn. And for us, this is where the persona-centered design process comes into play. I think it's a tool that we really use a lot in the very early stages of any design project. By the time you're doing DFM and all of that horrible, boring CAD work at the end, you're not really thinking about the personas anymore. But very simplistically, personas is almost creating these fictitious people that you're designing for. Instead of concept 1, 2, and 3, you're looking at concept Nick, Will, and Fraser. And we try to dissect those people and understand their needs and their behaviors and really designing towards them. Nick, Will, and Fraser are probably the worst example because they're all very similar. But as I said, as we get through the presentation, I'll give some examples so you can see how we use it and how we let it drive the brand aspect of industrial design, the wayfinding the creative visual brand language or experience brand language, as we like to call it. Probably important to focus on a moment about the difference between persona-centered design and user-centered design. And this is certainly not one is better than the other. These are both really relevant tools, but I love this way of framing it where user-centered design asks, can they use it? Where persona-centered design asks, does it matter to them? At Alquemy, we do a lot of work with startups or medium-sized businesses that often have some technology or a product idea, but they really don't know who their customer is and who they're selling to. And so the persona-centered process allows us to really wayfind that. So we're layering over the top of designing the actual product itself and thinking about functionality and the experience. We're also looking at it at a more brand level and trying to tap into those more behavioral aspects of those personas. I think it's really important to say this is less of a process, more of a perspective. I think this is a tool that can be injected into anybody's design process. I think every studio, every designer has their own approach to things, the 4Ds, but this really is a tool that you can slot in at many points along the way. It's also a really, really small part of any project. So today I'm going to be talking about a very narrow part of the design process. The project is obviously a lot bigger, and this is really quite a small part that can be plugged and played into different parts of that larger project picture. The first project, I know some of you in the room might be familiar with this gentleman, but we were working with a guy who lived in Joshua Tree named Doug Evans. Doug Evans famously created the Juicero juicer. It was the highest funded startup in Silicon Valley history. I think he raised $126 million and then just set the whole thing on fire. And he's a very creative guy. His next project, going from Juicero to Sproutero. So lots of taros in that guy's life. He's a mad health and wellness guy, super interesting dude. And he moved from the benefits of juice to the benefits of raw water until people started dying of bacteria, and then to the benefit of sprouts. He knew that there was a need. He knew that there was a product opportunity to grow sprouts at home, grow microherbs at home, but he really didn't know who his customer was and who he was trying to sell this to. He's a very myopic guy. He lives this very extreme health and wellness lifestyle. So the people that he surrounds himself with aren't really indicative of real people. So we use the persona-centered design process to really help him try and figure out who his customer is and how he can approach them and how that can inform the product design itself. We had 3 personas, but for the purpose of time, I've just simplified these down to 2. And this is a really broad look at the holistic foodie. Typically, when we do persona work, it's this initial hybrid approach of looking on social media, chasing hashtags down rabbit holes to try and really get a pulse of who is in this community, this kind of sprouting space. So we're starting with real people who are showing a fake life, which is what Instagram ultimately is. But what that allows us to do is understand the aspirational aspect of those personas themselves. And as I get later on into the presentation, you'll see that we do make sure that we come back and do real ethnographic research and talk to real users and anchor it in reality. But as a tool to be creative and help navigate, it works really well. So with our holistic foodie, a lot younger, we were finding with this particular trend of sprouting, it was a lot of young people who are often raw vegans. This was right in the tail end of COVID. So there was also a lot of in-person sharing, being able to be around people again, have people in your home. And that really led us to looking at forms and materials that had an inert environmental story, but also could create a visual brand language that provided presence and something a little bit more unique. It's not going to live in the garage. We want this thing to be pride of place in the home. So looking at how that influences the materials, the forms, user interfaces, and user experience. So we were using ultrasonic mist to grow sprouts. So on one path within the business, we're looking at getting pond foggers from Bunnings and growing sprouts in the studio, which I can't tell you how bad our studio smelled every Monday morning. We had so many sprouts that we couldn't put them in the bin anymore. No one wanted to eat them. So we found out that one of the guys had been flushing sprouts down the toilet. So that was fun. And what we created for the holistic vegan was this very simple, very minimal, much more celebrated industrial design language, looking at glass materials, looking at terracotta. And then even when you jump into the user experience itself, keeping it very simple, building a strong presence and transitioning those user interfaces and user experiences to be a little bit more digital forward, more smart forward. And I suppose for Doug Evans, this really allowed him to see his product within this niche lens. What you're ultimately trying to do with persona-centered design is come to the table with 3 really bifurcated or trifurcated concepts that are really different from each other. And there's going to end up being things wrong with each one. And you're trying to use it as a tool to wayfind where your client sees his brand going. As a contrast to this, the next persona we were looking at was our super sprouter. And this was really interesting, again, going back to using social media as a early, quick and dirty research tool. When you start chasing hashtags on Instagram, you find these really interesting fringe people that can teach you a lot about user behavior. And this bloke here on the left, he now has a matcha tea business, but at the time, he had a close to Michelin star restaurant in New York where he was making these crazy decadent desserts using completely sprouted grains and nuts and seeds and things like that. And so all of a sudden, this guy's needs as a user are really different. So how we approach this second persona versus the first persona are really, really different. And then they foster a really strong conversation between us and the client to try and figure out where they want to go. Who is your customer? So when we look at our super sprouter, he's probably working in a more professional setting. And this was the scope of this project. There wasn't even an understanding of, is it a consumer product? Is it going into restaurants? Is it going into Whole Foods? It was very, very broad. So the vegan super sprouter, he's going to need something with a little bit more precision. It's more about control. It's less about presence and show. It's more about performance and get it done. So the product that we envisioned for him had a lot more control. The user interface was very deep and much more immersive. You could create your own programs, even down to the point of being able to stack these. We had ventilation on the side so that you can get a lot more control, because we want to give this guy the opportunity to grow lots of different types of sprouts and have control and knowledge about it as he's going. So you can see that comparison between the two concepts. And as far as it went with Doug, what was really interesting, the persona that I kept out tonight, because Fraser wouldn't let me include it because I spelt mum with an O, because it's an American client. I know. So, and I couldn't find the InDesign file. But the organic mum ended up being where the project went. We pulled bits and pieces out of each persona, but ultimately what this process allowed us to do was really pick the eyes out of the opportunity with the client and give them the tools to understand who we're trying to sell this to and who we're trying to design for. And what's super interesting about this process when it's done right, it influences way more than just the product itself. It starts to influence their branding, their website, all of their collateral. So getting in that early and trying to have that influence over the branding of industrial design and using this tool, I think it makes the job a lot more fun than just this concept's a square, this concept's a circle, and that one's a squircle. The next project that I wanted to show you guys another example of this was a chair that we've been working on for what feels like about 83 years. This was another startup out of California that came to us with a very simple brief of outdoor chairs are terrible. I want a nice outdoor chair. When you get a problem that's that open, there's so many different ways you can approach that. You can approach that from a mechanical standpoint. You can approach that from an ecosystem of accessories. So again, for us, anchoring it in the persona-centered design process allowed us to look at different personas and look at what their needs might be. Again, I've omitted one of the three personas from this project. That persona was a dude named Drew, and it was super techie. Lots of cool folding stuff. I never really loved the concept, but it needed to be explored. The other two personas, we looked at Amanda. This was very much based on the client themselves. They often do like to see themselves in the persona. But again, this is a real person that we go down the rabbit hole, a lot of social media work. There's actually been times where we've then reached out to these people through social media and had interviews with them to see if we've got it right, and we'll A/B test with them. And you actually end up having this weird relationship with a social media influencer as a sounding board for your design process. But for Amanda, like any good multi-millionaire LA-based mum, it's all about taking it easy and being quite relaxed. This was all about reducing complexity, bringing versatility to the table through usage occasions inside and outside of the home, not just thinking about this as a camp chair or a beach chair. Looking at some of the language attributes, it became more premium, more sort of fashion forward. We weren't scared of looking at a design that we knew was going to be way higher than the budget needed to be. Because again, at this early stage, we're sort of wayfinding. We're looking at these kind of really extreme ends of the design opportunities. So for her, we looked at this really contemporary, beautiful elevated materiality. We had this interesting folding mechanism again in parallel to all of this work. We're making models out of pipes from Bunnings. I mean, Bunnings in Artarmon has so much of my money. It's ridiculous. So this is a small part of a big picture, but looking at these mechanisms that have this really elegant folding, looking at more premium materiality, and again, trying to sort of blur that line between at home and out of the home. This was right in the middle of COVID when people were having lawn parties out the front of their house. So suddenly your folding chair that usually only goes camping with you now has this different kind of presence in the home. The other thing that was really interesting about the Amanda persona is through understanding her needs and interviewing people like her, we were able to identify this opportunity for an ecosystem of accessories. So instead of just designing a chair, we wanted to treat it a little bit differently, where there was an infinite roadmap to be able to attach different accessories to this thing and make it more useful and more beneficial for the user. And that was something that ended up carrying across the whole brand and has now become their mantra, I suppose. It's more of an ecosystem. It's also a really great way to have more products available for customers. So many startups, they run this gauntlet of going really hard and then they bring a product to market and they're out of money and they're completely exhausted. And if they do well, their customer is sort of saying, well, what's next? Where's the common tiger table or tent? But with this product approach, we're able to then give accessories, beautiful kind of footrests and cup holders and parasols. The next persona, very different to Amanda. Connie, much younger, living in a city, really, really different needs. Again, this was at the height of COVID. So there was a lot of rooftop barbecues and things like that happening at the time. So really trying to understand how Connie is going to relate to this chair and looking at how we might mirror her lifestyle, where it's a bit more playful, it's a bit more optimistic, it's a little bit more social, and it's less about being in the home. And also just her aesthetic is much more bifurcated from Amanda. It's really looking at these very bright colors, these really interesting textiles that are coming from the footwear industry, and really trying to understand how we can imbue some of that detail into the product itself. So we came up with this concept here, which was really interesting because it's a really different gesture. It feels a lot more new and iconic, a lot more boundary pushing than the first concept. We also developed these really interesting mechanisms where the chair could actually swing. So it had this casual, playful nature to it as well as being a beautiful object. I think also really importantly with Connie, learning through her persona the importance of brands being able to offer personalization. So custom fabrics, custom skins, this ability to have your own version of the chair and not just be like everyone else's version of the common Tiger chair. What's interesting about this project is it actually made it to market, but this tool really allowed us to work with the client to pick the eyes out of each concept and do the Frankenstein into the final version. So what we learned from Amanda was really this idea of adaptive, which is the accessories and being able to build an ecosystem, a really elevated design aesthetic, something that doesn't feel like something you'd buy at Decathlon, and something that's still quite iconic. While learning from Connie, it was this idea of something that's bespoke that you can upgrade the aesthetic of, a bit more optimistic and also more conscious materials. And you can start to see the hybridization of this now, where we have those accessories, we have really nice fly knit covers that can be replaced to be cleaned, or you can pick your own color. And again, it just became a really, really powerful tool to have those conversations with the client to figure out who they're trying to sell to and what they want this product to be. I think it's a really good example of following this process and coming to something that's new, familiar, and has given this startup who have just launched, there's actually a container of these coming from Taiwan at the moment, just in time for the tariffs. And I could have done a whole talk about this chair. It's been the most roller coaster project I think our studio's ever had. David Knott, my business partner on the right-hand side there. So I think a real testament to the process and how it's really helped us encourage the client to understand who they're selling to, not just what they're trying to build. And like I said before, the influence goes so much greater than the product. This has then influenced her branding, her web, all of her color selections. It's had a really big impact on her brand beyond just the product itself. Last but not least, the reason why I included this one is I wanted to touch upon persona-centered design outside of just aesthetic and system imaging like the first two projects. iFixit are a really interesting brand. They've done a phenomenal job of shaming Apple into finally adopting replaceable batteries and having access to repairing these products themselves. And we were approached by them a few years ago to look at helping them build their own first tech product, which was a soldering iron. The thing that was really interesting to me about iFixit is for a brand that was selling a lot of product, they still didn't really know who their customer was. They didn't know if their customer was a hobbyist or was a professional. So we use those very specific terms to design these personas to look into their needs. So starting with Beck, who is firmly a hobbyist, another social media influencer that's got 2 million followers doing laptop repairing videos, which are probably a little ASMR-y. But for Beck, it was really about trying to not create a language that was too tech forward and understanding that it is a tech product, but we don't want it to look like it's for the bros. Softer, more minimal, leaning into a language that feels a little bit more approachable. I mean, we are still working for iFixit, so it needs to be blue and grey. But looking at these softer ends, more interesting surface transitions, and very simple, minimal user interfaces. But the other part of this that was super interesting is we were able to look at the system itself, not just the aesthetic. We weren't given a technical package to skin around. It was take a big step back and look at how this particular persona is interacting with this product and develop an ecosystem for them. And I'll come back to that in a moment because I think this is a really great example of where persona-centered design can influence function as much as it can influence design aesthetic. So then we looked at Dom, who's a professional. His job is fixing products every day. Dom's a little bit different because he really buys into the right to repair revolution, which iFixit at the forefront of, looking at much simpler, more geometric, more intersecting forms, done in a really strategic way because we know that these objects need to be able to be pulled apart and rebuilt again. So trying to create a language that really embodies that idea of repairability and simplicity and tactility. So for him, we were looking at these much more truncated forms, more intersected details, much larger, more celebrated, more controllable user interfaces. But as we get down to his actual system itself, as opposed to Beck, this is designed to stay on your workbench at all times. You're not taking this with you. So you've got a lot more real estate. You can build these more connected ecosystems of products that you can build upon at home, where Beck was much more about on the go, take it with you. I might be going to Burning Man and fixing an art car. And what was really interesting about this project is we ended up getting to a point where Beck really drove the archetype and Dom really drove the language. So again, a really useful tool for having those conversations with clients to figure out what they want. And where we ended up was this product here. So you can see the language itself is much more serious, professional, extruded forms, truncated forms, but the actual archetype itself is this simple, portable, easy to take with you. Let's get the hobbyists before we go after the professionals. Again, using this process as a method for truly understanding what a client wants, because they never do. It's just a sad fact of it. And this has, for us, been a very successful, repeatable tool to drill down into where the client needs to take this product or where the brand wants to take this product. I wanted to very quickly finish on the how. The first thing we tend to do is stakeholder alignment. A lot of stakeholder interviews at the very beginning. Some clients will tell us the personas they have. Big companies like Pyrex, they often have their own marketing persona, and that gives you a little sniff of a direction to go after. But the other clients that are small to medium or startups, they generally don't know. So getting in early and having that conversation with the client to understand if they have a sniff is a really great place to start. And like I said earlier, it's really looking at social media, Reddit, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it might be. The highfalutin way of calling it trend and culture mapping, but really trying to understand who these users are from an aspirational high-level standpoint. It's exactly like designing a product. You're coming back to the client with 5 people that have very specific views and behaviors and needs, and you're going through the process with the client to talk through who these personas are to try and really hone them. Then I think is the most important part of this is the ethnographic validation, because Instagram is just, of course, what we all want people to see we are, or in my case, photos of my dog. So this ethnographic validation is really important. Otherwise, you're just riffing off a dream a little bit, which can be very dangerous. And then the last part is really making sure that once you've got that persona dialed in, you're using it as a storytelling tool. Like I said earlier, it's not about concept 1, 2, 3. These persona-centered concepts really allow us to tell a story to the client about who the person is and how we're solving their problems and meeting their needs, whether it's from a visual standpoint, a UX standpoint, and it becomes this consistent thread through the project. That story really drives the design the entire way through. If you can get it to become nomenclature within the relationship, you've nailed it. Just wrapping through these, the value, clarity and definition at the front end, I always find it a really great way to figure out how we're going to do concepts. It's not square, round and squircle. It's Doug, Greg and Susan. And that, I think, for a lot of designers is the hardest point. How do I start these concepts and what's the value of each one? And this just gives you that right up front. Early alignment, like I said, getting a really good understanding with your client of where you're trying to go and who they see their customer as being and helping them really refine that. A guiding North Star, obviously, I've hit it a few times, but just having this really clear understanding, it just takes a lot of that ambiguity out of the process. And that kind of, I just don't like it factor. I'm sure we've all had that with people in our businesses or clients, and it's an impossible moment to manage. And what the persona-centered design process is, it just completely devalidates that. And you can say in a much more polite way, I don't care that you don't like it. The persona work is leading us here. This is where the trajectory of the brand needs to go. So it really helps you navigate those opinions, which can always be a little tricky. And then last but not least, I think it's really that storytelling component that you drag across the entire project, whether it's early concepts in a way to tell or sell a concept into a client, anchoring it in that story that's based on a person is incredibly valuable. And what I've found almost every time, assuming the client commits to the project and you get to the other end, you use that persona the entire way through. It becomes such a strong tool for getting you clarity, even when you're in tooling, even when you're trying to pick CMF, even when you're then working on the website or the brand. This can really drive a lot of that.
Thanks for listening to this redacted special episode. We hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to check the show notes for links to learn more about Phil Rose and Alquemy, where to follow Redacted, plus listen to more of our episodes. Thanks for listening, and until next time, this has been a Redacted special episode.